Sick of the globalist, eugenicist control freaks adding poison to your water and laughing as you get sick and die? Start purifying your water with ProPure. My friends, I've done a lot of research, and the best gravity filter out there, bar none, is ProPure. And it's available discounted at INFOWARS.com. Its filters are silver impregnated to prevent bacterial growth. There's no priming required. It's NSF 42 certified. Optional fluoride filters can reduce fluoride up to 95%. Easy to set up and use. Doesn't require electricity. Purify water from lakes, streams, ponds, and wells. This filter system leaves in beneficial minerals, which is key. Save money by not buying bottled water and avoid BPA that leaches from the plastic. ProPure is the best gravity-fed filter out there. It's what my family uses. INFOWARS.com already has the lowest price on ProPure. But if you add the promo code WATER at checkout, you get an additional 10% off at INFOWARS.com. You can also call to order 888-253-3139. Thank you for joining us. We are joined by Professor George W. Grayson. He is an author and researcher, PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and amongst his many laurels. And he's been a professor for several decades at William and Mary. And he is one of the leading experts on the kleptocratic collapse of Mexico that has killed, what is it, 60,000 in the last 5-6 years? That is spilling over our border. That is one of the biggest national security threats to this country. And he joins us today to talk about his new book, The Executioner's Men, frightening breakdown of exactly what's happening. The Executioner's Men, Los Zetas, rogue soldiers, criminal entrepreneurs, and the shadow state they created. Something I think our drug war, if it continues, can basically create here, like it's done in New York and Chicago on a mini scale. And Professor George W. Grayson joins us now. Sir, thanks for coming on the broadcast.
The pleasure is completely mine, Alex.
Well, you're one of the leading experts on Mexico. It pops up in the news here and there when the State Department says, don't go there, it's dangerous. Describe for people, start at the beginning. What's happening in Mexico on a timeline? Where are we now? Where do you see it going?
There are enclaves of violence, for example, in the border areas, and I'm talking about south of Texas. You have several cartels, mainly the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, who have joined to battle Los Zetas. Los Zetas are the most sadistic, fiendish, brutal criminal organizations, at least in the Americas. And one of their standard techniques is decapitation. And I don't know that you could see my friend here.
Yes.
But he, of course, is just a mannequin. But the Zetas have executed through excruciating torture hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And they especially key in on the military. But their goal is to infuse fear in everyone with whom they come into contact, whether it's average citizens, the police, the military, or politicians. The Zetas are in about 21 states, and they go down Mexico's east coast. If you turn to the west coast and look at the state of Sinaloa, that's the headquarters for the Sinaloan cartel, which is, of course, headed by Joaquin Guzman, who typically goes by the name El Chapo. But Alex, I know you'll have him on your program, and he doesn't like to be called El Chapo because that means the short one. He prefers to be called El Tio, and so I would recommend that salutation for him. The Sinaloa cartel really controls the Pacific Coast area, but they want to get to Nuevo Laredo, which is the major portal for the entry of drugs and other illicit goods into the United States. And that's one reason they're battling Los Zetas in the north.
What are the numbers? Because I see 40,000 in the last 4 or 5 years. I see 60,000. It almost becomes a background weather report, how many hundreds of heads are dumped off on the border every week. What's the numbers of the carnage we're talking about? And is Mexico officially a failed rogue system, a failed state, a road warrior type scenario?
Well, I use figures from La Reforma newspaper because it's a reputable source, and plus there's consistency in the figures. And what they show today is almost 44,000 drug-related deaths. That may be on the low side, but that's an approximation. But there has been a sharp increase during the Calderon administration. And of course, Felipe Calderon swore the oath of office on December 1, 2006. And he has really encountered, I think, all the woes of a latter-day biblical Job. There was a flu epidemic, tourism is way down, the country has suffered natural disasters, and of course, above all, there is the wanton, brutal torture and killing of civilians and cartel members by the underworld. Mexico is not a failed state in the sense of being a failed country. It's got universities, it's got political parties, banks, financial institutions, and just lots of the elements of a nation state. But there are areas of Mexico, enclaves, much of the state of Michoacan on the west coast where La Familia hangs out. Areas in cities such as Ciudad Juarez are unsafe at any speed. And you've also got places like Veracruz, where the last couple of governors have been joined at the hip with the Zetas, and that's a dangerous place. Having said that, I wouldn't hesitate at all to go to Cancun or to other resorts. Mexico City, which I just visited to observe the July 1 presidential election, has become a sanctuary city. And that is, the cartels have their families there. And so while you have gang violence, you don't have the gunfights at the OK Corral that you find in the north or that you find in Veracruz.
So it's almost a demilitarized zone or a Switzerland where they can park their families.
It used to be that there were several Switzerlands. Guadalajara used to be one. Nuevo León, or at least Monterrey, also enjoy that kind of atmosphere. But those cities have turned into war zones. And so now it's probably Mexico City, Mérida, which is in Yucatan, on the Yucatan Peninsula, and also Querétaro, which is about a 2.5-hour bus ride north of Mexico City, which I find to be one of the safest cities in the world.
All right. Now, expanding on this, Mexico's a beautiful, wonderful place, a lot of really neat culture, but then it has this corrupt government and then these drug cartels, you know, basically fouling the whole situation. Again, Professor, you're one of the leading experts on this, so, I mean, don't talk to us like we're 5 years old, but give us some of the basics here, because I'm just, 3 hours away from Mexico, but it seems like a whole another world, even though I've traveled extensively all over it, but it affects us to a great extent. So break down, why did everything accelerate in its implosion under Felipe Calderon? What do you expect? You were just there for the election. Is there truth and fraud? Break down some of the basic players for us so we can understand what's happening, and then let's get into your newest book.
Well, of course, the major players are the cartels. And we've mentioned the Sinaloa cartel, which is the most powerful. The second, at least most brutal cartel, are Los Zetas. They're in 21 states. And you have the Gulf cartel, which is focused in Matamoros and Tamaulipas in the north. There are a half dozen other cartels, but they are the major ones. Now, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, governed Mexico like its fiefdom for 71 years and finally lost power to the National Action Party in July of 2000. Under the old PRI, there was a informal deal that had been struck with the capos. The mafiosi would pay rich rewards to governments at the local, state, and national level. And of course, the PRI had corrupted all of society, and it also corrupted the drug business. In return for this, these monies, the cartels followed certain rules of the game. They didn't sell drugs in Mexico. They didn't kidnap civilians. They didn't get armaments that were more powerful than those of the army. If they had to kill someone, they did it in a remote area. And in general, they paid respect to governors and mayors, and there are plenty of instances where these elected officials hobnobbed with the kingpins. That lasted until really the late 1980s, early 1990s, when there was a convergence of three factors. First of all, the U.S. authorities were successful in interdicting the flow of narcotics into Florida and the southeast of the United States. And so the Colombians, and to a lesser extent the Peruvians, had to find new routes to get to that big nose in El Norte, namely the United States. And therefore they moved through Central America and through Mexico. And the upshot was what had formerly been a multi-million-dollar business became a multi-billion-dollar business. The second thing that happened was that, as I mentioned, the National Action Party, or the PAN, took over the presidency. And the first PAN president was Vicente Fox, who was an excellent campaigner, but it turned out he couldn't organize a one-car funeral. He didn't like having shadowy groups from Mexico City enforce the rules of the game, because if the capos broke those informal rules that I mentioned earlier, the army or certain brigades or the federal judicial police would come down on them like a ton of bricks. Fox thought it was better to use better trained, better compensated, more technologically efficient local police. And the problem with that, as you've often discussed,
they got bought off.
They quickly got bought off. And finally, NAFTA, although a godsend for the macroeconomy in Mexico, greatly increased the flow of goods and services. And among those goods and services were drugs and weapons.
Wow. Now, obviously, the elements of the CIA have been caught bringing drugs in to fund covert operations before. We've seen all these Mexican officials in the news saying, stop saying our officials are corrupt. You've got plenty of them, too. And we've seen all the cases of local police, feds, you name it, involved. But, again, we got CIA people like Dewhurst running for Senate here in Texas. He's saying he's going to shut the border down. We've got all these forces. I talked to Sally Castile, who was a DEA agent, 6 years ago, and he said, groups are being funded in Mexico. There's going to be a Western-backed or U.S.-backed destabilization campaign. From your research, how does the United States and drug policy and corruption here, Professor, feed into the witch's brew that's been unleashed in Mexico?
Well, some U.S. officials have drunk that witch's brew. There's just so much money floating around in it, to mix metaphors, that you are going to have members of our security services who are corrupted. But what you have in Mexico is a culture of corruption where it's